Hello, can you hear me?
Okay, it's okay.
Yes, loud and clear. Okay, now we see you. Hi.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Della from Brigham Young University. I wish I could be there with you today. I looked forward to coming to Greece for months, but certain events came up which prevented me from being there. I hope you're all having a wonderful experience together and that you're also enjoying the food, which I feel like I'm missing out on. It's past midnight here, so forgive me if I'm not as alert as I normally am, but I'll do my best. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation on sugar reduction strategies. There are many conflicting and simplistic narratives and assumptions surrounding sugar and health. So I hope this presentation will help by providing some practical context for the discussion on sugar reduction strategies, for targeting which sugars and in what context they matter most. So hence my title, Refining the Target, Differentiating Sugar Types, Sources, and Substitutions for Cardiometabolic Health. Sorry, just trying to progress here. It's not going forward. Let's see. There we go, sorry about that. Okay, no conflicts of interest to declare here. Okay, sugar is consumed, assessed, and reported on in a variety of ways. Commonly, within studies, it's lumped together into categories as a uniform exposure to evaluate its impact independent of food source and form. However, as I'll talk about today, it's important to consider the context in which sugar is consumed, whether it's in liquid sources or added to foods, intrinsic within foods, or as excess energy, or in substitution in energy balance to determine what metabolic impact sugar has. So sugars can be categorized on a chemical level, and this might be useful when considering mechanistically the metabolic fates of fructose versus glucose. But when investigating sugar, we don't want to overlook potential interactions with the food matrix, and we want to understand whether sugar has differential impacts depending on the food source, regardless of whether it is added to that food source or it's naturally recurring or occurring within it. So that's why looking at the sugar context is so important. And doing so can help explain why sometimes we see different results between studies and explain why sugars from different foods may not have equivalent health impacts, even if chemically identical and consumed in the same amounts across sources. It may also explain why treating sugar as a uniform exposure in epidemiological studies has not always shown consistent results because data on the context and food source are either lacking or not evaluated. So another critical layer in this discussion is the role of energy. Much of the purported harm of sugars appears to be mediated by excess calorie intake rather than sugar itself. But that might also depend on the sugar source, as I'll talk about. So in addition to my own research, much of what I'll present on is based upon the foundational work that many of you have published on sugar and chronic disease, which has really helped to shape the scientific landscape on this topic. So when it comes to sugar and type 2 diabetes, much of what we know and what the dietary guidelines on sugar are based on comes from studies on sugary drinks. But that's only part of the story. Sugar-sweetened beverages are well studied due to their high intake in many countries and the ease of measurement within studies. But this has left important gaps in understanding other sugar types. So to address this, we conducted the first comprehensive dose response meta-analysis to evaluate not only different sugar types, like fructose, sucrose, total, and added sugars, but also to directly compare sugar-sweetened beverages to these and fruit juice as well, which had not been adequately examined, sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit juice side by side in relation to type 2 diabetes risk. So we're able to include with this report very large population sizes as listed here, and the included 29 cohorts stemmed from Europe, the United States, Asia, Australia, and Latin America. So here are the key findings from our meta-analysis. Panel A on the left shows the risk of type 2 diabetes for every 20 grams per day increase in different sugar types. So you can see in the blue bar that sugar sweetened beverages stand out with the strongest association with increased risk. Fruit juice showed a smaller but still significant increase. In contrast, you can see the same sugar amount, 20 grams per day, from total added sucrose and fructose categories was not associated with higher risk. And for total sugar and sucrose, the association was even inverse, suggesting potential protection at moderate intakes. So clearly we see that when the amount of sugar is the same, the impact can differ substantially depending on the type and source of sugar. So most of the studies here were adjusted for energy intake, BMI, and many other lifestyle factors similarly. The rightmost bars of that left-hand panel compare real-world serving sizes for sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit juice. In the pink bar, every 12-ounce serving of soda, 39 grams of sugar, was linked to a 25% higher risk of type 2 diabetes, while an 8-ounce serving of fruit juice showed a 5% increase. So, and then you see the dose response curves on the right. Sugar sweetened beverages show a strong linear increase from the very first dose, indicating no clear safe threshold. And fruit juice also trends upward, but it's less steeply and with more uncertainty. Total added sucrose and fructose sugars show nonlinear or J-shaped curves that trend downwards, suggesting a neutral or even a protective impact at low to moderate intakes, but risk increases with higher doses, that J-shaped curve. So overall, these results suggest that sugar's health impacts on type 2 diabetes are not uniform. They depend on the sugar type, the source, and the dose level. Only sugars from sugar sweetened beverages and to some extent fruit juice, so liquid forms, consistently showed harm. This underscores the need to distinguish between sugar types and sources and to not treat them all as equal. Otherwise, we might miss critical nuances that matter for both biological understanding and also for public health guidance. So now shifting to source-specific sugars and other chronic diseases and outcomes beyond type 2 diabetes. So this is pooled evidence on the left-hand side from meta-analyses of prospective cohorts. Fruit and yogurt consistently show protective associations across many outcomes, including metabolic syndrome, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and mortality. Dose response curves for fruit and yogurt are typically L-shaped, indicating risk at too low of intakes and benefits with higher consumption. Fruit juice shows more nuanced dose-dependent relationships. We see a U-shaped association for some outcomes. Moderate intake appears neutral or beneficial, but risk increases at higher doses, with 100% fruit juice typically showing a lower risk compared to juice drinks. For treats and toppings, results from large Swedish and UK cohorts revealed U or J-shaped curves for cardiovascular disease and mortality. The lowest risk was with moderate intakes, about 5 to 9% of energy intake. So this showed there is room in the diet for some treats and toppings. For honey, it's not shown here, but for honey, ice cream, and confectionery, they typically show no association with metabolic outcomes. And total dairy, as well as milk and cheese separately, have shown inverse associations with type 2 diabetes. So what is the percent energy intake of added or free sugars that is commensurate with optimal health or linked with the lowest risk of mortality and cardiovascular disease? And in a large Swedish cohort, added sugar intakes that were too low, so below 5%, or above 20% of energy were linked to the highest mortality and cardiovascular disease rates, so showed a U-shaped curve. And they reported that the lowest mortality occurred between 7.5 to 10% of energy from added sugar. So importantly, when they looked at sources, sugar sweetened beverages were the only source consistently linked to mortality. And all the other sugar containing foods they looked at were not. So these findings challenge the idea that less sugar is always better. Instead, they support a more nuanced view to limit sugar sweetened beverages, but allow modest amounts of added or free sugars for the greatest overall benefit. Okay. So when we isolate sugar sweetened beverages, the evidence becomes remarkably strong. Across multiple large meta-analyses, sugar sweetened beverages are the only sugar source consistently associated with harm. This is across nearly every major health outcome.
I don't
No,
I'm sorry, I hear some voices now. Is someone interrupting? I can't tell. Or can I continue?
You can continue, Karen.
Okay,
Just
I'll
unmute
just
it.
continue.
Yeah.
So when we isolate sugar sweetened beverages, this is where we start to see more remarkably strong evidence. You can see that across multiple large meta-analyses, sugar sweetened beverages are the only sugar source consistently associated with harm. And this is across nearly every major health outcome. So hypertension, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, mortality, there are clear linear dose response relationships that show increased risk with even modest intake. Similarly, we see this with cardiovascular disease, NAFLD, and gout. Looking at large cohorts, comparing liquid to solid sources overall, for NAFLD, sugar sweetened beverages, but not solid sugar sources were strongly linked. For colorectal cancer, sugar sweetened beverages, but not sugary foods were associated with higher risk in a large multi-ethnic cohort. And the UK Biobank study showed that free sugars and beverages had a linear increase in cardiovascular disease, while sugars from solid foods had a U-shaped relationship. So this growing body of evidence underscores that the form of sugar really matters, and liquid sugars carry the greatest risk. When sugar is consumed in a liquid form, it may have distinct metabolic effects when compared to when it's consumed within a fiber-rich cellular structure or other nutritious source, or even just when it's consumed in a solid food. So therefore, the evidence is clear enough that public health initiatives surrounding sugar should differentiate their recommendations by source and context of sugar, and should prioritize reducing sugary beverage intake. There's enough evidence for that. So a central question is whether sugar's harm is due to its unique metabolism or simply from excess calories. So while most prospective studies adjust for energy intake, controlled trials provide the strongest evidence to isolate sugar's effects in different energy contexts. So first, looking at the pooled effects of chemical sugars in substitution trials, when sugars replace macronutrients with no extra calories added, there's a lack of consistent evidence of an adverse effect. Fructose shows even slightly beneficial effects at low doses for glycemic control. Harm is only seen at very high doses, especially for triglycerides, which don't really reflect real-world intakes. Addition, hypercaloric trials, this is where sugar is added to the baseline diet and creates excess energy. These consistently show harmful effects for weight gain, higher triglycerides, insulin resistance, NAFLD markers, et cetera. So this indicates that sugar is only harmful for these outcomes when consumed in excess. But much of this evidence is based on chemical sugars in liquid form. So the question arises, is the same true for actual food sources consumed in excess? So the source and energy control can potentially both modulate the outcome. And that's why the work of Dr. Stephen Piper and others comparing food sources under different energy conditions has been so valuable. So when looking at food sources, not just the pooled effects of chemical sugars, is when you see more of a signal. So I'll very briefly summarize some of their work, what they found in their series of meta-analyses of controlled trials. They found that sugar sweetened beverages had an adverse effect on all of these listed outcomes here. In some cases, they were harmful, not just in addition trials, but also in substitution when energy levels stayed the same. Looking at other sugar sources, fruit and 100% fruit juice tended to be neutral or beneficial. Often fruit and sometimes 100% fruit juice were reported to be protective, even when they were provided as excess calories. For most other sugar sources, there were often null effects. So these important findings highlight the need to not lump all sugar-containing foods together in policy. Otherwise, we risk discouraging nutrient-rich foods. In a recent study, we examined how free versus intrinsic sugars compared to starch and fiber affect body fat and cardiometabolic risk in substitution and association analyses. This was a multinational cohort where diet and health status were assessed multiple times over 18 months in over 1,000 participants from Denmark, Portugal, and the UK. And we found that substituting 20 grams of free sugar with intrinsic sugar led to significant decreases in multiple measures of adiposity. When that same amount of sugar was replaced with starch, it resulted in significant increases in body fat and BMI. So we found that starch led to greater increases in body fat than free sugars. Additionally, when starch replaced free sugar, that is when we observed a significant increase in HbA1c. So this indicated that dietary starch may be more impactful on long-term glycemia than moderate intakes of free sugars. So we knew that fiber intake was low in this population, so the type of starch was likely of a lower quality or more refined. Altogether, we found that while intrinsic sugars and fiber were protective, starch was linked to higher fat and worsening cardiometabolic risk, and free sugar was either neutral or beneficial. So despite widespread belief, the idea that sugar is uniquely harmful or a main dietary driver of type 2 diabetes is not well supported by high-level evidence. The only exception is sugar from sugar-sweetened beverages. Contrary to popular belief, refined starches often produce greater postprandial glycemic responses than sucrose or fructose-containing foods. In a preview sub-study, I was able to conduct together with Dr. Jenny Brown Miller, shown on the right, we found that a higher dietary GI was associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, whereas added sugar was neutral and total sugar showed an inverse association. So this really started to add to the common theme I began to see in my research, which is not what I expected when I initially got into this topic in my PhD, was that when energy and BMI are controlled for, dietary sugar is not related to risk of type 2 diabetes. The major exception being when it is in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages and when it's consumed in excess, right? Because sugar can lead to weight gain, which may mediate its impact on type 2 diabetes. However, what I did begin to see more consistently was that the glycemic index and low quality dietary starch were related to increased risk. So this suggests that GI and GL, not sugar content alone, may be more relevant metrics for glycemic control. Yet sugar tends to receive more attention in the popular media and even among health professionals. Common advice is to reduce sugar intake to manage and prevent type 2 diabetes. The glycemic index, I believe, captures the real impact of how carbohydrates affect blood sugar, regardless of whether they are sugars, coming from sugars or starches. So we can learn a lesson from recent history. Nutrient-specific fear can lead to poor substitutions, which can inadvertently increase disease risk. So the public often views low sugar products as healthier, and these foods may swap sugar for refined starches. This can lead to unintended health consequences. A narrow focus on sugar can misguide reformulation efforts and cause more harmful high GI foods to be overlooked. We need to help to educate public understanding that low sugar doesn't necessarily mean low risk, and to teach that sugar can be enjoyed as part of a healthy diet that emphasizes overall carbohydrate quality. Sugar-sweetened beverages are really the exception here. They may be unique in how they deliver sugar to the body and are consistently linked to cardiometabolic disease. So reducing excess sugar, especially in beverage form, remains a prudent target. I believe effective nutrition policy should avoid nutrient tunnel vision and instead consider overall carbohydrate quality And rather than condemning all added sugars, guidelines might consider the differential effects of sugar based on its source and form. Okay, thank you very much.